My name is Mia Carter. I'm 33 years old, and I was banned from my own father's funeral by the woman who married him. I was standing in the lobby of Riverside Funeral Home, surrounded by the smell of lilies and cold air conditioning, when a security guard stepped in front of me like I didn't belong there. "Ma'am, you're not on the list," he said quietly. Through the glass doors, I could see my stepmother, Brooke Lawson Carter, in a black dress she'd clearly planned in advance, greeting mourners like a grieving widow. When she noticed me, she didn't flinch. "This is for immediate family only," she said. "Don't make this harder." I walked back to my car, shaking, not knowing she'd just triggered my father's trap. "Before I go any further, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever been the child who stayed quiet to keep the peace, only to be pushed aside when it mattered most, hit like and subscribe."
I read every comment, and you'd be surprised how many inheritance stories start just like this. Small exclusions that turn into something unforgivable. Stay with me, because this wasn't just grief, it was calculated. I grew up in a small, quiet suburb where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen, at least on the surface. Maple Ridge wasn't special. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone mowed their lawn on Saturdays, where the mailboxes all leaned at the same tired angle, where kids rode bikes in circles until the streetlights came on. But it was home, and for a long time, it felt solid in a way I didn't know how to question. My dad, Daniel Carter, bought that house before he ever met Brooke. Back then, it was just the two of us. He worked long hours, came home smelling like oil and sawdust, and always tried to make up for the time he missed by doing things with his hands. When I was 7, he built a treehouse in the old oak out back. I remember standing barefoot in the grass, holding nails while he hammered, the late summer sun burning my shoulders. He let me help even when it slowed him down. "This is ours," he said, wiping sweat off his forehead. "We'll always have this." For a long time, I believed him. When Brooke entered our lives, she didn't storm in. She didn't raise her voice or demand attention. She smiled. She brought over neatly wrapped casseroles. She told my dad he deserved happiness, and told me she'd always wanted a daughter. I was old enough to sense something off, but young enough to tell myself I was imagining it. The first changes were small. The living room furniture shifted. Family photos were rearranged, then quietly replaced. Brooke liked clean lines and neutral colours. My dad said it was nice to have someone who took an interest in the house. I noticed that the pictures of me slowly moved farther from the centre of the wall, then disappeared altogether. Holidays became complicated. Christmas morning used to mean mismatched wrapping paper, and my dad pretending not to know which present was mine. After Brooke, everything matched. Everything was coordinated. Harper, Brooke's daughter, got the big gifts, the ones that required batteries and space. I got sweaters, books, and practical things. Brooke always said it was because she knew I was mature. I laughed along, because that's what you do when you don't want to seem ungrateful. The comparisons crept in next. Brooke never said them angrily. She said them like observations. "Harper is just so easygoing. Mia's always been sensitive. She takes things personally." My dad would nod, uncomfortable, and change the subject. He hated conflict. He believed silence was the same thing as peace. By the time I was in my 20s, I could feel the shape of my place in that family. I was welcome, but only if I didn't need too much. Only if I didn't disrupt the version of harmony Brooke worked so hard to present. When I came over, she stayed busy. Phone calls, errands, quick excuses. I started timing my visits around her schedule without ever admitting that's what I was doing. Eventually, the garage became our refuge. My dad turned it into a workshop, filling it with tools and half-finished projects. That was where we talked. About my job at the insurance office. About the way adulthood didn't feel like I thought it would. About nothing that might require him to stand up to his wife. "She means well," he'd say, staring at the workbench instead of my face. "She just needs time." Time stretched into years. The Thanksgiving she uninvited me was the moment something inside me finally broke. Brooke texted that morning, saying someone had the flu and they were keeping the gathering small. I spent the day alone, heating up leftovers and trying not to check my phone. That night, I saw photos online, everyone crowded around the backyard table, laughing,
perfectly healthy.
I stared at those pictures until my chest ached,
realizing I hadn't just been forgotten, I'd been excluded on purpose. After that Thanksgiving, the excuses stopped feeling accidental. They started sounding practiced. Brooke didn't need to tell me I wasn't welcome anymore. She just made sure invitations never reached me. Birthdays were suddenly low-key. Dinners were last minute. Family news came filtered through Facebook posts and second-hand comments. When I asked my dad about it, he sighed like I was asking him to solve a problem he was too tired to face. "She's trying," he said once, rubbing his temples. "Blended families are complicated." What he didn't say was that blending only ever seemed to go one way. Harper moved into the house when she was 23. Brooke told everyone it was temporary. Harper had just gone through a breakup, lost a job, racked up credit card debt. My dad nodded sympathetically and cleared out the guest room. No one asked me how I felt about it. No one even told me it was happening. I found out when I drove by one afternoon and saw a second car parked in the driveway, one I didn't recognize. Inside, the house felt different, more crowded. Harper's things were everywhere: shoes by the door, jackets on chairs, makeup on the bathroom counter. She acted polite enough, but distant, like I was the visitor. Brooke hovered around her constantly, offering snacks, asking about her day, defending her every complaint. I watched it all from the edge of the room, feeling like a ghost in the place I'd grown up. That was when my dad started asking me to come by only when Brooke wasn't home. He'd call and lower his voice, even though he was alone. "She's at book club," he'd say. "If you want to stop by." We sat in the workshop those days. He showed me what he was building: cabinets, shelves, little boxes he never finished. The radio hummed quietly, and the smell of wood felt safer than the rest of the house. We talked about my job, about how tired I was all the time, about how I felt stuck. We didn't talk about Brooke. We didn't talk about Harper. We didn't talk about the way he flinched every time the door from the house creaked open. Once, I asked him directly why things had changed so much. He didn't answer right away. He kept sanding the same corner of a board until it was smooth enough to be useless. "I just want everyone to get along," he finally said. "I'm tired of fighting." I nodded, because I didn't want to be another thing he had to manage. A few months later, I overheard them arguing late at night. I'd stopped by to drop something off and was standing in the hallway when Brooke's voice cut through the house, sharp and controlled. "If you keep choosing her," she said, "you're choosing against me." My dad didn't raise his voice. He said something low and pleading that I couldn't quite hear. I remember standing there with my keys digging into my palm, realizing that this wasn't about misunderstanding or adjustment anymore. It was a negotiation, and I wasn't in the room. By the time I turned 30, I'd learned how to make myself smaller. I stayed late at work, took extra calls, told myself independence was strength. When my relationship ended, I didn't tell my dad right away. I didn't want to add another complication to his life. I told myself that needing less was the same as being loved. The last time I saw him alive, we were in the workshop again. He talked about the treehouse, how he'd been fixing the ladder, sanding it smooth. "For someday," he said. "You never know." I smiled, even though I didn't know what he meant. When he died suddenly a few weeks later, I thought at least the pretending was over. I thought grief might level things, strip away the quiet politics. I believed, stupidly, that death would make space for honesty. Instead, Brooke called me 3 days later and told me the funeral was for immediate family only. That was when I finally understood that I hadn't been fading out of my father's life by accident. I had been pushed, and he had seen it happen. 2 weeks after the funeral, I wasn't allowed to attend. My phone rang in the middle of a workday. I was at my desk in the insurance office, staring at a claim file I'd already read 3 times without absorbing a word, when I saw an unfamiliar number and almost let it go to voicemail. "I'm calling about Daniel Carter's estate," the man said when I answered. His voice was calm, practiced. "This is Grant Halloway. I was your father's attorney. I need you to come in for the reading. It's important that you're there in person." Important was not the word I expected to hear. I took the afternoon off and drove downtown with my stomach knotted, replaying the funeral in my head. I kept imagining Brooke's face. the way she'd looked past me like I was an inconvenience she'd finally managed to remove. Part of me wondered if this meeting was just another formality I'd be politely excluded from. Grant's office was quiet and overly air-conditioned, the kind of place where the chairs were leather and the coffee tasted burnt no matter how fresh it was. Brooke was already there when I arrived, sitting at the long conference table with Harper beside her. Brooke stood when she saw me, her smile tight and brittle. "I didn't realize you'd be coming," she said, like this was a social mix-up instead of a legal obligation. Grant didn't bother with pleasantries. He waited until we were all seated, then opened a thick folder and adjusted his glasses. "We'll begin," he said. Daniel was very specific about how this was to be handled. The first sentence changed everything. "To my daughter, Mia Carter, whom this document recognizes as my sole biological child and primary beneficiary." Brooke's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she jerked upright. Harper's head snapped toward her mother, confusion written all over her face. I felt the words land somewhere behind my ribs, heavy and unreal. Sole biological child, primary beneficiary. Grant continued without looking up. He read that my father's house on Maple Ridge, purchased before his marriage and maintained solely in his name, was left to me. The workshop and all tools within it were mine as well, with a note about preserving it as a space for creating. My hands trembled under the table as I pictured my dad sanding that ladder, fixing things quietly, planning for a future he wouldn't see. The rest of the estate followed. Investments, a small vacation cabin, vehicles, 70% to me, 30% to Brooke. "What about Harper?" Brooke demanded, her voice sharp now, the performance gone. "She's family." Grant finally looked up. "She'll be addressed later," he said. "She has 60 days to vacate the Maple Ridge property." Harper stood so fast her chair tipped backward. She didn't say anything. She just walked out of the room, the door clicking shut behind her. I thought that was the end of it. I thought the shock was the point. Then Grant reached for a second envelope. "There's more," he said, turning to me. "Your father instructed me to give you this if his wife prevented you from attending his funeral." The room went completely still. Brooke's face drained of colour. "That's ridiculous," she said. "This is private." Grant ignored her and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in my father's handwriting, the lines uneven, the ink pressed hard into the paper in places. "Claire," Grant began, then paused. "I apologize. Mia." I barely breathed as he read my father's words aloud. An apology. A confession. An admission that he'd seen what was happening and hadn't been brave enough to stop it. That he knew Brooke would try to erase me once he was gone. That this, everything, was his attempt to make it right too late. Brooke lunged for the letter, but Grant blocked her without raising his voice. "These were Daniel's instructions," he said, "and I'm not finished." He opened another folder, thicker this time, filled with handwritten pages, printed text messages, calendar entries, dated, organized, documented. As he began to read, I realized my father hadn't just left me an inheritance. He'd left evidence, and Brooke knew it. Grant read entry after entry in the same steady voice, never rushing, never softening the words. Dates, times, short paragraphs written in my father's careful handwriting. Notes about plans he made with me that never happened. Birthdays he wanted to celebrate but didn't. Holidays where he stood in the kitchen, listening to Brooke explain why there wasn't room for me, even when the table clearly had empty chairs. I felt sick listening to it, not because I was surprised, but because it confirmed everything I'd spent years doubting myself over. I hadn't been dramatic. I hadn't been imagining things. My father had seen it too. He just hadn't stopped it. Brooke finally found her voice and tried to interrupt, saying this was private, that these were normal marital disagreements being taken out of context. Grant calmly pulled out printed screenshots of text messages. Messages from Brooke calling me needy, saying I was trying to come between her and my father, suggesting it would be healthier if he created distance from me. My father's replies were short, non-committal, never agreeing, but never defending me either. Grant explained that my father had started saving those messages 2 years earlier, after an argument where Brooke threatened to leave him if he kept prioritizing me. That was when my father realized he was too weak to fix this while he was alive, but maybe he could at least make the truth undeniable after he was gone. By the time Grant finished, Brooke's composure was gone. She stood up, pointing at me, her hands shaking as she accused me of manipulating my father during our garage conversations. She said she'd given up her career to take care of him, that she'd earned more than what the will gave her, and that she would contest it. Grant didn't look surprised. He slid another folder across the table. Medical records, cognitive evaluations, documentation from my father's doctor showing clear mental capacity, regular checkups, no signs of confusion or decline. The will had been updated 6 months earlier, after a full evaluation. "You're free to contest," Grant said evenly, "but you should understand the risks." I left the office feeling hollow. Vindicated, yes, but emptied out at the same time. Knowing my father had seen everything didn't undo the years he let it happen. I would have given back the house and the money for one moment where he chose me while he was alive. The next weeks blurred together. Brooke filed to contest the will anyway. She hired an aggressive probate attorney who froze the estate and dragged everything into court. At work, I missed deadlines. I stared at my screen without seeing it. At night, I lay awake reading about inheritance law, my shoulders tight, my jaw clenched. Brooke didn't stop at the legal battle. She called relatives, spinning her version of the story. She posted vague messages online about respecting the dead and being disappointed in people who show up when money is involved. Messages started trickling in from cousins, asking what was really going on. Some were kind, others were suspicious. All of it felt like being put on trial in public. Uncle Rick called me one evening and told me he was done staying quiet. He said he'd watched Brooke push me out for years and regretted not speaking up sooner. He started calling other family members, asking them to write down what they'd seen. Neighbours, friends, anyone who'd noticed my absence when I should have been there. Then Grant called again. A woman my father worked with wanted to talk. She said she had information about his state of mind when he changed the will. By the time my estate attorney, Tessa Monroe, laid out the evidence we had, journals, messages, witnesses, medical records, I understood something clearly for the first time. This wasn't just a fight over money anymore. It was a fight over who got to define my father's truth. The courthouse smelled like old paper and disinfectant, the kind of place where arguments went to be flattened into records and rulings. I arrived early, hands cold despite the heat, wearing the one professional dress I owned. It didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel exposed, like I'd dressed up for something I couldn't control. Brooke was already there when I walked into the courtroom, seated at the opposite table beside her attorney. She wore black again, tasteful and restrained, a folded tissue placed carefully near her hand. If I hadn't lived with her version of grief for 8 years, I might have believed it. Her lawyer, Calvin Wexler, leaned close to her, whispering. He had the confident posture of someone who expected people to get tired and give in. Tessa Monroe met me by the aisle and nodded once. Calm, ready. She carried a box thick with paper and a thin legal pad with neat handwriting. "Just answer what's asked," she said quietly. "Let the documents do the talking." When the judge entered, the room stood and sat again, the ritual steadying and impersonal. Calvin rose first. He spoke about love and marriage, about how grief made people behave unpredictably. He described me as distant, estranged, someone who had drifted away and returned only when money was involved. He asked me about the years I didn't visit, the holidays I missed, the gaps in our contact. I answered carefully. I talked about the garage conversations, about the invitations that never came, about being told gatherings were small, while photos later proved otherwise. Calvin tried to twist it, suggesting I'd manipulated my father's guilt, that the will was an overcorrection born of regret. Brooke nodded along, eyes shining, the wronged widow perfectly composed. Then it was Tessa's turn. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't appeal to sympathy. She opened the box and began laying out evidence the way my father had intended, methodical, dated, undeniable. Journal entries with times and places. Text messages printed cleanly. Brooke's words impossible to soften.
Witness statements from my uncle, my aunt, neighbours who noticed I was always missing. A sworn statement from Elaine, my father's co-worker, detailing conversations about regret and deliberate estate planning. The judge read silently, turning pages. The room held its breath. Then Tessa introduced the funeral home records. She handed the judge an email log and a signed instruction note. It showed that Brooke had contacted Riverside Funeral Home directly and requested that I be removed from the guest list. The reason given was that I was unstable and that my presence would cause disruption. The judge looked up. "Mrs. Lawson-Carter," she said, her tone even, "why did you instruct the funeral home to block your husband's daughter from attending his service?" Brooke's face tightened. She began to speak, then stopped. She tried again, saying it was an emotional time, that she was protecting the family, that it wasn't meant to be cruel. When the judge asked which family members had objected to my attendance, Brooke named Harper. The judge noted calmly that Harper was Brooke's daughter, not my father's. Tessa didn't press. She didn't need to. She reminded the court of the medical records. Cognitive evaluations performed months before the will update. Clear results. No impairment. No confusion. She pointed out the no contest clause, my father's explicit instruction that any unsuccessful challenge would result in forfeiture. Calvin objected. The judge overruled him without looking up. When Brooke took the stand, she cried about her marriage, about sacrifices, about devotion. But when asked to explain the documented pattern of exclusion, she couldn't. Her answers circled back to intention without evidence, feeling without facts. The judge leaned back, folded her hands, and spoke slowly. She found no merit in the claim of undue influence. She found clear intent, documented thoroughly. She found a consistent pattern that matched the records. The will stood, the contest failed, the clause applied. Brooke lost everything she'd tried to take. The gavel came down softly, final. I didn't feel victorious as the room emptied. I felt steady. The truth had been said out loud, on record, where it couldn't be edited or buried. My father hadn't stood up for me in life, but he had made sure no one could erase me after his death. The house didn't feel like mine right away, even after the judge's ruling made it official. Brooke and Harper were given 30 days to move out, and in that strange limbo, the rooms seemed to hold their breath. I didn't step inside at first. I drove past slowly, the way you do when you're not sure you're welcome, even when the law says you are. Brooke didn't speak to me after court. Her attorney handled everything, clipped and formal. But she wasn't finished trying to control the story. I heard from relatives that she was telling people she'd been robbed, that my father had been turned against her, that I'd taken advantage of his weakness. I let the rumours circulate. I'd spent years trying to correct her quietly. I wasn't interested in that anymore. Harper was the one who reached out. She texted late one night, asking if we could talk before she moved out. We met at a coffee shop halfway between my apartment and the house. She looked smaller than I remembered, worn down by a version of her mother I'd known all along. She told me Brooke had once tried to pressure my father into adding her name to the deed. He'd refused. That was when things at home became unbearable for him. Harper hadn't realised how much of her comfort had come at my expense. I didn't forgive anyone at that moment, but I listened. A week later, my estate attorney called with a quiet warning. During the move-out inspection, several items were missing from the house. Documents, small valuables, things that should have stayed. Nothing irreplaceable, nothing worth another legal fight, but enough to tell me Brooke still believed she could take what she wanted if she was quick and quiet about it. I stood in the empty workshop that evening, surrounded by my father's tools, and understood something clearly. The court battle was over, but the truth had only just settled. And if Brooke tried to rewrite it again, I was ready to stop protecting her version of events. I didn't celebrate when it was finally over. The morning after the last paperwork cleared, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold in my hands. My shoulders felt stiff, like I'd been carrying something heavy for too long and only just set it down. Winning didn't feel like joy.
It felt like being able to breathe again, slowly, without checking over my shoulder.
A week later, I went to the house for the first time by myself.
The rooms were quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The hum of the HVAC, the only sound filling the space. Sunlight came through the blinds in thin lines, settling on floors Brooke had chosen but no longer controlled. I moved carefully, almost apologetically, like I was walking through someone else's life. Legally, it was mine. Emotionally, I still felt like a guest. I saved the workshop for last. The smell hit me as soon as I opened the door. Wood, oil, dust. The familiar comfort of a place my father escaped to when the rest of the house became too tight. His tools were exactly where he'd left them, outlined on the pegboard in careful marker lines. Nothing here had been rearranged or polished for appearances. This was the only space Brooke hadn't managed to touch. I noticed the ladder leaning against the wall, the one that led up to the treehouse. The wood looked newer than I remembered, smoother.
He'd been working on it recently.
I climbed slowly, testing each rung, feeling the quiet weight of what he'd hoped for. Inside the treehouse, tucked into the corner, was a small wooden box with my name carved into the lid. Inside were photos from when I was little. Me on his shoulders, me grinning with missing teeth, us standing in the yard before everything changed. At the bottom was a folded note in his handwriting. He'd written that he kept these separate so they wouldn't be thrown away. I sat there for a long time, holding that box, understanding something I hadn't wanted to face. He protected the memories. He just didn't protect me when it mattered. Rick and Diane came by later that week. Their apologies were quiet and imperfect, full of pauses and regret. I didn't rush to reassure them. I told them we could rebuild something new, but we weren't pretending the past didn't happen. They nodded, accepting that boundary without argument. Healing came in small, practical decisions.
I changed the locks. I chose paint colours.
I cleared out one drawer at a time. I decided the workshop would stay exactly as it was. I would trade the house, the money, all of it, for one moment where my father chose me while he was alive. But I don't get to rewrite his choices. I only get to decide what I accept now. That night, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize, mentioning my father's name and something he'd left behind that wasn't listed in the will. I didn't call back right away. For the first time, I wasn't afraid to hear what came next. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, hit subscribe. This story isn't just about a house or a will. It's about what people do when they think you won't fight back. Like this video, share it with someone who's been pushed aside in the name of keeping the peace, and tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were me. I read every story, and sometimes the next one sounds a lot like yours.